The zombie capitals. Will the zombie capitals die this time?
Okay, we're on. Welcome, members, friends, and new listeners to the Global Justice Report, a new production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Bob Stone, your host for today's program this Monday, June 22nd, 2020. I'm very happy to have as our speaker today Betsy Bowman, president and co-founder of the Center for Global Justice. She holds a PhD in French literature, but her specialty for the last nearly 15 years is economics. She'll be speaking on the collapse of the international economy, preceded the pandemic, or, subtitle, the oncoming deluge of debt. We are lucky to have Tony Smith as discussant for Betsy's talk today. Tony talked last Monday, on zombie capital. He is emeritus professor of philosophy at Iowa State University and author of Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, a wonderful study of the effects of having to live under capital's imperatives. I'm going to tell a little bit about the center and turn it over to Betsy. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research and learning center in San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, Mexico. It's devoted to research and learning for a better world. And since 2004, we've offered educational programs in English for expats here in San Miguel and visitors to San Miguel, and in Spanish for the wider population of our community. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Nature from the global 1% to the global 99%. Coronavirus has recently set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism, our current economic system. Our weekly Global Justice Report will examine this system and grassroots alternatives to it that are democratic, such as self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, and public banking. Please join in today's discussion by using the chat feature on YouTube. Send your written contribution to the broadcast. All programs are recorded and can be downloaded from our website. I'll say a few words about what's coming before turning over to Betsy. Next Monday, June 29th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Central Time, and 3 p.m. Eastern Time, join us at our Global Justice Center website for Jeff Foe's 13th Global Justice Lecture. His title is, Can Democrats Defeat the Fascist Threat? Jeff Foe is Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington and is an old friend of the center. The following Monday, July 6th at 11 Pacific, 1 Central, and 2 Eastern, join us at our Global Justice Center website for a Leo Panich's talk titled Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic. Leo is Emeritus Distinguished Research Professor of Political Science at York University in Toronto and co-editor of the Socialist Register, which he has edited the annual volumes of for the past 35 years. His latest books are Searching for Socialism and The Project of the Labor New Left, From Ben to Corbyn, co-authored with Colin Lays. So I'm now going to turn the floor over to Betsy and her talk on the collapse of the international economy preceded the pandemic, or the oncoming deluge of debt. Betsy, take it away.
Welcome once again to all of our members, friends, and new listeners. I'll talk first, and then Tony will join the presentation to help answer questions and to add to, expand upon what I'm saying. I hope you were able to hear him last week on will the zombie capitals die this time? You know, we're witnessing a very crazy Ponzi switch. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the US government's taxing power was used to reduce inequality. Remember when the notion of equality was something that we aimed for? Since the Great Recession of 2008, however, that power is actually sustaining inequality and even increasing it. Reagan's 1930s predecessors loudly warned FDR's government to butt out of the economy. But now that the government's taxing power is bailing out rich bank and corporate executives, those new beneficiaries and their allies are silent. If government can help the poor, why can't it help them, they ask. Before such open claim to undeserved privilege, we mere citizens feel like people of color. We are excluded, expendable. By taxing power, I mean the Federal Reserve's power to digitally lend no strings attached cash to rich banks and corporations. CEOs use the loans to buy back their firm's shares from existing shareholders. If those CEOs and managers and boards of directors own shares, their assets automatically rise in price due to reduction in the number of outstanding shares. Shareholding managers who sell at the right time after the market has been pumped up with infusions of borrowed money or debt to increase the price per share, they can cash in at the pivotal time to make quite a lot of money. And then, of course, the bubble pops and the price goes down. What they're doing is they have elected to reduce capital that they might invest in the firm's profitability, shrinking its economic role. In short, by such loans, the Federal Reserve indirectly, but knowingly, enriches corporate elites at the expense both of taxpayers and of their own firm's profitability. How can the Federal Reserve, a government-like institution, although it's really a private corporation owned by the big banks, how can it further enrich those who are already fabulously wealthy by raising the national debt that all of our progeny must retire, sacrificing at least their education and health? Isn't this an unfair intergenerational crime? But wait, it gets worse. Recall that many of today's buyback beneficiaries earlier claimed that their risk of bankruptcy had entitled them to profit. They're taking a risk, so they deserve the profit. In a sense, they thereby forswore any bailout should they fail. Unprofitable zombie firms are failures. But since this was their manager's own doing, the pleas for a bailout by those same managers are now doubly nullified. Recall also that many bankers' fraudulent mortgage schemes from 2008 still go unpunished. But their use of Federal Reserve loans indicate they expect rewards for their crimes. The mountains of debt that have piled up since 2008 to deal with the economic crisis are easily explained by the criminal misuse of government by and for the privileged. It's as if the fraudsters expecting punishment were resting content with present gains or expecting a future government's vindication, an ominous possibility as November 3 approaches. Were the Fed's cure actually working, it would still demand punishment, but it is instead introducing a new crisis of bankruptcies, as Tony Smith warned last week. To blame the pandemic, that just doesn't wash. The current economic crisis is not due to the pandemic. The damaging cure for the economic crisis started back in 2008. What I want to understand and share with you now is why we've had 3 successive recessions in a short 20 years. And at the end of each recession, the economy regained its balance at yet a lower rate of profit, lower rate of production, consumption, lower rate of employment, and precarity of work has increased. The gig economy is everywhere. And we certainly can no longer say that the United States is the richest country in the world with the amount of debt that has piled up. And we'll get to those precise numbers in just a moment. But the real question turns on a deeper question. Why is corporate profitability in steady decline? Tracking this decline, we start with the burst of the dot-com bubble in 2000, 2001. Some $5 trillion worth of wealth was wiped off the stock markets. The Federal Reserve's answer was to repeatedly lower interest rates, and lower them they did until almost very, very low. And this fueled the housing bubble. So the cure created yet another problem. And as we all know, the housing bubble exploded in 2008. This bubble started with Clinton's repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. In 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, And it had separated deposit-taking banks from brokerage firms. After the repeal, these firms could all merge, and the resulting financial innovation brought us, you'll recall, MBSs, mortgage-backed securities, CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, derivatives, credit default swaps, and other risky financial instruments. Now, this was done to save the stock markets, and it did save the stock markets, but it also mired millions of people in mortgages that they could not afford and that they later lost to foreclosure. The unhoused epidemic is greater now than ever. Worthless securities in 2008-9 dumped into pension and other funds in the capital markets had provoked a crisis. But the $800 billion TARP rescue package became a $17 trillion bank bailout. Big banks merged with hedge funds, becoming mega banks, postponing yet again the debt-driven depression. Now, what is the debt today? It's always useful to check what's the national debt today. In 2000, it was $5.764 trillion. We entered 2000 with no deficit, but the debt was still 5.7 trillion. 10 years later, the US debt had almost tripled to 13.5 trillion. And of course, that was after all of the tax breaks of the early Bush term and the bailout, the TARP money, which was paid back, but there was still all of the other 13 trillion of bailout money that a lot of it ended up on the US debt. By 2015, the US debt had gone to $18 trillion. This is after 4 rounds of quantitative easing, which was done by the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other central banks. This program of buying long-term securities from banks certainly saved the banks, but it created massive amounts of money in the money supply. And the money supply, since the dollar was taken off the gold standard back in 71, 73, has expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams or their worst nightmares, depending upon how you look at it. As of Thursday, June 18th, the national debt was 26 trillion. Now in this chart, you'll see it starts in 1990 and going up to 2000, it doesn't increase enormously, but then starting in 2000, it starts to just zoom up. And the chart ends in 1918, but we know what to expect. Buying back shares, borrowing money to buy back shares was illegal until 1982. It was considered to be a market manipulation. And during the time since the 2008 crisis, trillions have flown into the US economy with little inflation in consumer goods. But there's been a lot of inflation in equities, housing, securities, bonds, other assets. And this is all propped up with borrowed money. The debt, however, has not disappeared. It's now at 131.08% of GDP. It's of last Thursday. Today, it's even more. But the depression was postponed. but it's still threatened. After the 2000 dot-com crisis, household borrowing to stay afloat continued. In 2000, wages had been flat since 1975. Standards of living could only be maintained if more household members worked or if money was borrowed. With rising home prices, home equity loans seemed a sure way to get kids through college or lower credit card debt. In 2008, household debt ballooned to $800 billion. Unemployment was 10%. 12 years later, in 2020, household debt is over $13 trillion. I mean, how did this happen from less than 1 trillion to 13 trillion in 12 years? That's a staggering amount of debt. Unemployment is now 16%, or there are about 25 million people unemployed. 8% of mortgage holders in the US are in arrears of their monthly mortgage payment. How does this household debt today break down? Well, auto debt is $1.35 trillion. The bankruptcy of Hertz is not going to improve the used car market, that's for sure. Student loan debt is at 1.5 trillion. I mean, just a year or two ago, it was 1 trillion. Credit card debt is now at 1.1 trillion. And mortgage debt is 800 billion, with 8% of mortgages overdue. So there's this huge amount of debt, and we can't pretend that this that the financial crisis that this is causing was somehow magically conjured up by a health pandemic. Last Monday, Tony Smith on the Global Justice Report traced the debt crisis back to 1973, just after the US went off the gold standard. There should have been a depression back in 73, Tony contends, but it was put off by government intervention in capital markets. Massive loans based on future revenues were made to already indebted corporations and individuals. The corporations used the loans to buy back their own stock, and the corporation themselves became zombies, not making enough profit to service their debt. And yet the Federal Reserve continues to buy up their bad bonds and other assets by lending out money. And who knows how much of that money is going to end up on the national debt. But first, to return to our question, why don't these corporations make profits? Well, I'd like to suggest that today's corporate structure, having owners and managers on one side allocating value and workers on the other side creating value, this no longer reflects or rewards actual value flows. The top sectors of corporations, managers and the boards of directors, claim priority in receiving corporate gains, but they contribute the least to producing value in the goods and services sold. Exorbitant compensation packages, I mean, they don't even call them salaries anymore. Compensation packages for top management and boards of directors are exorbitant salaries and stock options. And, you know, these are the 1%. This is how they do it. But corporations are composed of three identifiable groups. They're the on-site managers, the management, which is actually needed since it's reported that about 70% of workers hate their jobs. There are absentee owners who receive dividends as bonuses for taking a risk and investing in the company. And then there are the workers who actually do the work and therefore create the value that is monetized in the prices of the firm's goods and services. This structure's goal is clear to everybody, and it is to maximize profits for owners and managers. If the workers get paid enough to live on, well, that's nice. But the real goal is to make profit for the board of directors, all of the management. Now, as a substitute for profits from production, these stock buybacks have inflated the market price of the firm's stock shares. So managers exercise their stock options for optimal returns. Meanwhile, the corporation is loaded with additional debt and interest that is payable in the present. This confiscates the future of taxpayers' children and reduces the corporation's operating capital that's needed to make profits. Now, what's wrong with this picture? It's a caricature, a reversal of the actual flows of value in real world enterprises. Workers who best know their machines and first catch malfunctions are at the point where value is created. And if liberated to solve problems together as co-owners of those machines, they are collectively best equipped to manage their enterprises. A new worker owners of a hoist factory in Mexico City, by taking time to jointly observe each other's workstations, cut production time by a third and won new contracts as a result. If corporations did not pay excessive compensation packages to their CEOs and managers and board of directors, nor pay dividends to absentee owners, the amount of profit that is needed to be profitable would be much lower. Worker buyouts of capitalist firms, together with self-management training, can be easily funded by public banks rooted in communities. In a society with government-funded healthcare, profits would not need to also cover the expense of health insurance. By reducing the number of claimants on the profits from 3 workers, managers, and owners to just 1, worker owners and managers, eliminating absentee owners, and making professional managers the employees of the workers, self-managed worker co-ops would be more efficient than hierarchical corporations that are pledged to sustain non-working owners. Now, the CARES Act that was passed a few months ago was supposed to help the average citizen. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program. But according to some sources, the Paycheck Protection Program gave a tiny New Jersey bank $5.3 billion. The Paycheck Protection Program is for paying salaries of people who would be laid off due to the closing, due to the pandemic. A tiny New Jersey bank can't possibly have enough employees to use up $5.3 billion. And Citigroup got actually $3 billion from the Paycheck Protection Program. Citigroup, of all institutions. Citigroup, they actually need government bailout to help meet their payroll. I thought Citigroup was one of the biggest banks in the world. And of course it is. But if the banks are in such good shape, why do they need a bailout? from the Paycheck Protection Program. But 3 billion, 5 billion, that's just peanuts. The Federal Reserve is loaning money to all the big banks through 10 of its 11 programs. And I've put up a list of the alphabet soup of names of these facilities. These are limited liability corporations that are set up by the Federal Reserve. They are designed to purchase toxic assets from financial institutions in contravention to laws regarding purchases of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is not allowed to buy toxic assets from financial institutions. But they set up these shell corporations, these little LLCs, to do that work for them. Primary market, listen to the names of these special purpose vehicles that they've set up. Primary market corporate credit facility, secondary market corporate credit facility, maiden lane facilities, corporate credit facility, Paycheck Protection Program liquidity facility. Oh, we know about that one. Main Street Lending Program, municipal liquidity facility, and there are others. And it's essentially the Fed's special purpose vehicles are like shell corporations, which are designed to get around the law and bail out the banks. And they did this back in 2008, and they're doing it again. So Wall Street is bailed out and Main Street is sold out. But as long as the stock market holds up, people think the economy is okay. But we know that's not true. Look at the people standing in lines for food pantries. Look at the unhoused people. How has the US national debt gone from 5 trillion to 27 trillion in 20 years, and yet we still have unhoused people, people with no health insurance? It's just is shocking. But let's look at some of the other signs, the warning signs that were out in the business press last fall, way before anyone had heard of the coronavirus. We've seen the SPVs that the Federal Reserve has made up and is using. Now, early signs of the economic distress starting back on June 8th. The 4.7 billion Woodford Equity Fund in the UK froze withdrawals. When your fund freezes withdrawals, you know they're in trouble and you get worried. July 7, Deutsche Bank, the central bank of Germany, confirms that it's slashing 18,000 jobs. When the banks are cutting jobs, they're in trouble. July 29, Bloomberg News reported that Citigroup was to cut hundreds of trading jobs in bad Wall Street omen. That's their headline. And this is back in July. It continues. August 8, reporters reported that among foreign sovereign debt carrying negative yields had increased to an all-time peak of 13.2 trillion. What that means is when people buy bonds from their own country, the foreign sovereign debt, the bond is carrying a negative yield. You put in $100, you get back 99. This is to keep your money safe, but you get back less money. This is a sign that there is a terrible problem in the international financial system. Okay. And again, the Wall Street Journal reports that investors continue to sell their bank stocks. send the shares of some of America's financial institutions sharply lower, following the latest sign of trouble ahead for the US economy. And back on August 14th, the Dow Jones plunged by 800 points or 3%. So the financial collapse that had been building up since 2008 was certainly almost upon us. More news from the business press. August 14th, for the first time since 2007, the US saw an inversion of the yield curve. Normally, the longer you hold a bond, the higher the interest rate. But back in August, the 2-year Treasury note had a higher interest rate than the 10-year note. Now that is a harbinger of an economic crisis, if ever there were one. September 17th, this is when I woke up and thought, oh my God, this is really bad. The Federal Reserve is intervening in the repo market. Banks lend to each other all the time overnight. They have to balance their books every night at the end of the day. And if they need some extra cash, they just borrow from each other. But on September 17th, the interest rate for interbank loans went from 2% to 10%, and the liquidity froze up, and banks went to the Fed to borrow money for their repurchase agreements. So the Fed is continuing this program. It started with a maximum of 75 billion per day to 24 Wall Street trading houses, with a cap of 40 billion going to any one firm. Well, then they upped it. Then they added 14-day term loans to its repurchase loan agreements, indicating that there's yet more problems in the banking sector. And of course, this is what happened with the liquidity crisis in 2007 to 2010. And then there's more repo term loans, more overnight loans, buying of US Treasury bills. These are all indications that the banks are in serious trouble, and the Federal Reserve, backed up by the Treasury, is bailing them out. Stop. So we, the public, need to know what is being done behind our backs and who is being bailed out at taxpayer expense. It should not be the Federal Reserve, a financial institution which is owned by the largest banks, which buys bonds from corporations and deposits money into the corporation's accounts so that they can then create 10 times as much money as debt. We need to know what's going on. Banks creating money as debt is yet another one of the fundamental problems. And it should be the government creating debt-free money for people to prosper, and not for the Jamie Dimons of this world to become billionaires. Now, BlackRock is a company or a hedge fund that is in charge of the secondary market corporate credit facility. And it's also in charge of a $454 billion slush fund from the CARES Act. And it's also responsible for investing the money in the $335 billion federal employees retirement funds. And it's a really big investment firm. The Fed chair, Jerome Powell, has about $11.5 million invested with BlackRock. The 454 billion slush fund over to first to Steve Mnuchin as the head of the Treasury and then to BlackRock will become the 10% reserves for loans of $4.5 trillion as BlackRock buys up its own exchange traded funds, ETFs. It's exchange traded funds that are not doing well. According to Ellen Brown, who will be on this program on July 13th, BlackRock, quote, is a global financial giant with customers in 100 countries and its tentacles in major asset classes all over the world. And it now holds the fire hose to trillions of bailout dollars from the Federal Reserve. Those who are familiar with BlackRock see it as simply an asset manager that helps pension funds through passive investments that track the stock market. That's why they're called exchange traded funds. It has also been called the most powerful institution in the financial system. It's the world's largest financial institution with over 7 trillion in assets. Now, 4 BlackRock executives who used to be employees of various central banks presented a proposal for an economic reset in August of 2019 at the annual meeting of central bankers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This is August. The central bankers knew there was a serious problems. They argued that the central banks were running out of ammunition. The main thing that central banks do is set interest rates. And this, as a solution to the economic problem, wasn't working. So they argued that the central bank should have fiscal policy. Of course, that's supposed to be written by the legislative arm of government. And this should be combined with monetary policy, setting interest rates, which is what the central banks or the Federal Reserve do. And the central bank should maintain a, quote, standing emergency fiscal facility that would be activated when interest rate manipulation was no longer working to avoid deflation. Now, with all of the confusion and upset about the coronavirus pandemic, nobody noticed that BlackRock was awarded a no-bid contract under the CARES Act to manage this 454 billion slush fund established by the Treasury with the Federal Reserve, which can be leveraged into more than 4 trillion in Federal Reserve credit. The latest news on Friday reports that the Federal Reserve is now tightening and is now going to aim its fire hose of money at Main Street and average people instead of huge financial institutions. Go back. We'll see if the stock market can hold up without its lender of last resort to buy its worthless bonds. And then on Saturday, Wall Street veterans were warning that the Federal Reserve was pumping up a bubble in the stock market. Sven Heinrich, the lead market strategist at Northman Trader, I'm not familiar with these people or these firms, said the lender of last resort, that's the Federal Reserve, has become the lender of the entire resort. The Fed has basically created a gambling casino at this point, and all the gamblers have moved in. From my perspective, the danger here is that the Fed is overdoing it and zombifying the economy. They're in the process of inserting itself ever deeper into markets. And that makes the Fed itself too big to fail. And the Fed losing control over the asset bubble is now the biggest risk factor to the economy. Well, an implosion of all the Wall Street debt added to an implosion of 13 trillion in household debt and a global pandemic forcing hundreds of millions into unemployment with the climate catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. You know, we need good government and we need sound solutions. I don't like bad news, and I don't like thinking that the elites are willing to sacrifice most of the planet for their own personal profit. The too large to fail banks and corporations are simply pursuing their goal to maximize profit, though profit is hard to come by these days in the normal production of goods and services sold to average people. And the zombie capitals, in Tony Smith's phrase, must be kept alive. Now, this all sounds very complicated, but when the US debt in 20 years has gone from 5 trillion to 26 trillion, and half the country is living in or near poverty, life expectancy in the United States is falling. Millions are in the streets around the world saying they can't survive much longer. Then we have got to ask, where did all this borrowed money go? We have to admit that borrowing more money is not the way to get out of debt. We also have to admit that there's something fundamentally wrong with the international financial arrangement. We have moved from 19th century productive capitalism to 20th century neoliberal privatization capitalism with austerity for the majority, to 21st century state monopoly capitalism, or another phrase for state monopoly capitalism is socialism for the rich and austerity for the 99%. But there are solutions. We have solutions. And when there's a crisis, sometimes what is politically not possible becomes absolutely imperative, such as nationalizing the big banks and the hedge funds, public banking, making debt-free money the norm through public banking, the government creation of debt-free money, and charge such banks with the funding of worker-owned and managed businesses, prevent loans to zombie firms, accumulated cultural knowledge which is available to all, such as the internet, machine translation of all languages and the like. These are elements of profit anywhere and might be compensated by universal basic income, providing the effective demand to enhance options so that all can thrive. A healthcare plan for all, like that enjoyed by our elected representatives, is a no-brainer. Community economic and environmental planning could halt the ecological collapse that is still advancing. A jubilee for odious debt, odious student debt, credit card debt, mortgage, and small business debt would allow fresh starts. We'll first need to answer the 1% who, holding the 99% of us in debt penury, arrogantly expect us to pass over their crimes in silence. But that calls on us to find our voice. And since solidarity with the least among us benefits all of us, our first words might be no justice, no peace, Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. A wonderful talk, very stimulating. extremely informative. I'm now going to open the floor to Tony Smith in Minneapolis, quite a lively city these days and a central point in our thinking. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share about Betsy's talk? We do have some questions from listeners.
Okay, well,
and listeners can add questions to the chat screen.
Yes, look on the lower right of your screen. You have a chat feature. Write in any question you would like for Betsy
Or
Tony to answer.
This is for Tony.
Okay, we have a question.
Well, let Tony say what he wants to say.
Go ahead. Excuse me, Tony, please.
okay. Well, how long? Oh, I can hear myself echo here. Okay, just a couple of things. Great talk. I don't want to talk about all the things that I agree with. It's just too long, a list, a lot of great information. Just let me stress what I think are incredibly important points that you make. The first thing is there already is a tremendous move to say that the crisis we're in now is some contingent thing, that it's the result of this virus that nobody could expect. And I think it's very important to see that is just completely false. The global economy was in a big problem before the crisis hit. The features of this virus make it worse in many ways than it might have otherwise been, more sudden, more abrupt, deeper. But that there was going to be some sort of problem is without question the case. And it's a problem rooted in the way global capitalism has worked for the reason that you talk out. So it's really important to stress that. It's also really important to talk about how the health of the stock market is completely disconnected, completely decoupled from life in our society. It basically is close to the point where it has so little to do with reality of anybody else except as a mechanism of getting money into certain people's hands. And politically, using political means to get money into some people's hands and not other people's hands. So the latest figure is the price earnings ratio, right? The price of the company's stock relative to its earnings is now 30. And that is 2 times the historical average of the price earnings ratio in the history of capitalism. So it's important to stress that what you're talking about is a new period in capitalism. Capitalism has never been as perverse as it is now. Right, and that's a measure of its perversity, right? That this price earnings ratio, a ratio of the value of the stock relative to the earnings of companies, is so out of whack compared to everything that's happened before. So we're in some different period of capitalism where it's in a very unhealthy state, and recovery of the stock market is a symptom of that and not a sign that everything is going well. I also want to just go back in the very end of your talk that this opens up a space for talking about political reforms, very radical political reforms. Ultimately, I think it opens up a space for a rupture with capitalism is really something important in your talk as well. If I could just talk about a couple of things where I had some problems or there's some clarification maybe is needed. I think it's important to distinguish what the Fed does from government debt. So the Treasury Department will sell Treasury bills, and that creates a government debt, and the government has to pay back the people who have bought the Treasury bills, pay them back with interest, and that comes out of tax revenues. And so the right wing is very upset when there's too much government debt, too many Treasury bills are out there in the hands of investors, because that does in fact mean the money has to be repaid back from tax revenues, and they start worrying about whether that will be the case, and they use that as an excuse to cut back on social programs and take away education, take away Social Security, and so on. I think we should resist that, because if investors are dumb enough to buy too many Treasury bills and the government can't pay that back, then they took a risk and they should take a loss. It should not mean that social programs, education, and so on necessarily get cut. So there's a battle about that. But the point I want to make here is The Federal Reserve operates differently. So in the Federal Reserve, if they can create money out of nothing, right? So they can get money into the banking system without having to sell treasury bills and without having to pay anybody any interest. They just have a balance sheet. They put down the number that they are going to put into the credit of the bank on their liability side, and then they talk about a loan to the they talk about the loan they get from the bank in their asset side, and it's just an explosion of their balance sheet. And there's nobody that has to be repaid back. And the hidden secret of capitalism is that money is a political creation. Capitalist money is a political creation. And it's not some natural thing, right? It's created in a political process. And they try to keep that a secret from us. But what this crisis shows is that that's the way it is, right? That if they want money for certain purposes, they can create it out of nothing. They don't have to depend upon the savings of a capitalist class to spend money. They can create it out of nothing. And there are limits to the amount they can do that, maybe, but who knows what those limits are? Japan has done this on some scale even beyond the Fed. And so this is a really important political point. We don't depend upon going into debt with people who buy treasury bills in order to fund what we want to do. We can create money out of nothing and use it as a way to allocate investment and base it on our public needs rather than based on what bailing out the banks and so on. So I would just like to throw that clarification in. The other thing I want to quickly mention is just the key question is, of course, why is this all happening? And I think you put your finger on the right issue. It has something to do with the problem with capitalist profits. I myself am not so sure that the main problem is too much money going into stock buybacks, too much money going into speculative investments, too much money going into stock options for the management. I don't think the problem that we face now is the flows of creating social wealth don't reflect where the money actually goes in capitalism, because I think that's how capitalism has always worked. Capitalism is always about giving money to people who haven't actually been part of the creative collective labor process of producing it. So that's not necessarily anything new now, although you're completely right to bring it to our attention again and stress it. My view is that the secret here is that what makes us at the end days of capitalism is capitalism was healthy when there was a region that had competitive advantage in the world market for an extended period of time because it had some big innovative advantage over everyone else. But today, there are so many countries that have figured out science, figured out technology, that if there's an innovation in one part of the world, all this funds come to develop that innovation all over the world, which means nobody can make a lot of money from selling it unless they can slap an intellectual property right on it and extract a lot of rent. And that's a separate conversation, but it means just getting profits from having a competitive advantage from innovation is so much tougher for capital today than it's ever been. And so the only way capital can keep, and so that creates problems in getting profit in the healthy way, quote unquote, from capital's standpoint. And so it has to figure out how to get profits in unhealthy ways, like a tax on labor and like the financial speculation you talk about. And I would put the emphasis on that, maybe more. So in other words, the stock buyback stuff and the craziness of the stock market, I see that more of as a symptom of the problem rather than the root of the problem. Now, maybe you agree with that or you don't, but that would be something to talk about. And then the final point I want to make is you can't talk about everything at the same time. And it's completely justified to focus on the US since it still is at the sort of center of the problem. But it's important to remember that the basic unit of capital is the world market. So it's not just the United States that has this issue, right? I mean, China has a version of this, right? China also has had decades of debt-fueled growth, which have now reached their limits, right? And so now China is getting its zombie capitals. And so all sorts of Chinese bonds, Chinese companies are defaulting on their bonds now. So I just think that's a big part of the story too. Everything you talk about is happening on a global level, and to get the full picture, we'll have to bring that in too. So I hope I talked too fast once again, but I'll stop now.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much for your comments, and especially for explaining how the Federal Reserve can just keep expanding its balance sheet infinitely, it seems. And now I know why it's so hard to figure out how much of that debt goes to the federal debt, because of course they're hiding it. They're keeping it all a secret. We have questions from our listeners.
Patricia Welty.
What is the distinction between deficit and debt? Well, the deficit is annual. That's the trade deficit, or the deficit in how much money the government takes in through taxes and how much it spends. And that varies from year to year. And the debt are all of the Treasury bonds and bills that are outstanding. So that's the difference between deficit and debt.
I hope that helps, Patricia.
Someone else asked, are SPVs actually Federal Reserve LLCs? Yes, I think they are. Yeah. And another question we have is, you advocate government creation of debt-free dollars. Isn't that what quantitative easing is? Well, the government, this is part of modern monetary theory. The government could create debt-free money. Abraham Lincoln ran the Civil War, or financed the Civil War, with debt-free money. He didn't borrow money from the banks. In a way, it's a question of national sovereignty. Is it the federal government that can create money, or is it banks? And today, since the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, it has been banks that are creating money as debt. So the flip side of debt is always credit. And before the 99% end up as creditors and in debt peonage to the 1%, which is a classic end of empire scenario, we need to make profound, deep changes, and we need to do them globally, not just in the United States, but everywhere. And we do have many solutions. The problem, of course, is politically getting those who think they're entitled to great wealth to realize that the whole structure of capitalism is jeopardizing all life on the human planet, all human life on the planet. What are some other?
Okay, I'll read one.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Could I jump in?
You had a comment, Tony?
Just a little. I mean, I think the question is very interesting, because I think there's a sense, there's a clear sense in which it's completely true to say quantitative easing is in effect giving debt-free money to banks. It has two components to it. So one is they can borrow at an incredibly low interest rate. So that means, I mean, in that sense, it's not debt-free money. But when you lend to a bank at 0.25%, And then, as you pointed out in some of your slides, they can turn around and lend out in terms of credit card debt or auto debt or student loan debt at 4, 5, 6%. Then in effect, you're loaning them something that's sort of like debt-free money. You're basically giving them money. But when the other part of quantitative easing is they have all these bonds. They don't know what the value of the bond is because there's some big economic downswing, and so the bonds that might have been worth X today, all of a sudden they may be worth like X minus some big Y tomorrow. When they basically quantitative easing is you sell that bond to the Fed at what its supposed full value, and in return the Fed gives you hard money. Now that's creating debt, that's creating money from nothing that doesn't have any without any interest attached to it. It's just basically like the question said, it's a debt-free creation of money for the banks. So I think the point here is, if they can do it for the banks, why can't they do it for the rest of us to deal with this crisis? If they can do it for the banks to deal with the crisis. So anyway, I'll stop.
Yes, and that is a question that we need to be asking of our legislators. If you can provide debt-free money to the banks, why not to everyone else? People can't borrow for 0.25% anywhere.
Okay, one further question, a global question about the effects of the pandemic. The pandemic has shut down global supply chains. Corporations had depended on these. This interruption in the flow of value was needed to service their debts. The 2020 stimulus package helped to bail them out temporarily, but it will soon how are these profitable capitalist production enterprises to be restored? How can we get back to profitable renewal of these supply chains?
I really can't speak to that question, Tony. Can you?
Well, I think it is going to be a problem. I think U.S. capital in particular, I think, really overbought how close AI was to introduce new forms of automation so that they could so-called reshore production into the U.S., but not have to deal with workers and their wages because they could just start installing all these AI systems. And I think they're now, for AI has always been oversold, and it's not going to be so easy to switch supply chains back into the U.S. and just automate factories and so on. So I think they're going to have to, if the trade war with China continues, there's going to be all sorts of investment made in Vietnam and Bangladesh and other places like that to try to reestablish supply chains. That's already starting to a large extent. But I think it is going to be a problem for U.S. capital. I think there was a time just a couple of years ago, everybody thought it was going to happen very quickly, that we could shut down global supply chains, move production to the United States, and not have to deal with the pesky workforce because the AI systems and high levels of automation were all about to bring about the age of robots. And I think that's not quite ready for that. And so there is going to be a big problem for U.S. capital here, for sure.
But then there's also going to be a big problem for U.S. workers.
Yeah.
If workers aren't needed anymore, what happens to the workers? And we see this around the world. There's a huge excess labor force. And the capitalists do not have a solution for that.
No.
They absolutely do not have a solution for that, except to consider so many parts of the world as, people who are expendable, as, just zones that no one cares about. And I remember years ago in a talk I gave saying at some point we are going to be asked, well, is it okay if sort of half of the planet dies in order to maintain the other half of the planet? And I always wonder when that day is coming, and it's always getting closer and closer. Do we have some other
We
questions?
do.
Oh,
Okay.
good.
Isn't the Fed already creating debt-free money as a kind of public bank?
Yeah.
Well, it's creating almost debt-free money for banks. And banks use that money to lend through fractional reserve lending. They use that money to lend 10 times as much, and they charge far more interest than what the Fed charges them, which is right now it's between 0 and 0.25%. So giving banks basically interest-free money is not going to help anyone except for the shareholders of the banks and the management of the banks. And the banks are not lending. I mean, we all see evening after evening on the news stories of small businesses who have not been able to get any money from the Paycheck Protection Plan or from the SBA. And how many people have gotten their $1,200 that they were supposed to get from the US government? I mean, I still haven't. Lots of people still haven't gotten that. So giving debt-free money to banks, you know, it would be nice if all banks were little small community banks who would lend into small community businesses, but that's not what they are. They're huge mega banks whose only profits come from speculation and charging very high interest rates on credit cards and so forth. And if there were debt-free money for municipalities, cities, states, that would be a huge help.
I've got a question that goes to the heart of the matter. What's wrong with the high debt levels? They haven't made the economy collapse so far. And under modern monetary theory, the state can always infuse liquidity into the economy to keep it afloat. So, vive la dette forever. Why not?
Well, the stock, Tony is absolutely right to say that the stock market has become completely unhinged from the real world economy, from the Main Street economy. PE ratios of 30 is crazy. I remember years ago, my stockbroker told me, oh, if it's PE over 15 or 16, that's not a stock to buy. But the stock market does affect our everyday lives, because if most of us have our retirement in the stock market, if the stock market crashes, that'll affect our retirement until there's a UBI, a universal basic income, or until Social Security is doubled or tripled, which it could easily be. The US government owes the Social Security fund $2.6 trillion. Well, the last time I checked, it probably owes them more now. But a huge amount of debt that is interest bearing is what is untenable, because people have to pay the interest on their debts. Average people have to pay the interest on their car loan, on their home mortgage, on their credit cards. Average people are being very squeezed. And now with the pandemic and the increase in unemployment, people are being squeezed even more. And the difficulty that so many people are having accessing government funds. And then of course, the rest of the world that doesn't have government funds, all Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. So much of the world doesn't have any, India doesn't have any kind of government programs to help them in this kind of situation. So,
Tony?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything Betsy said. Just to add something else to it, when you have massive debt out there, it's like a deck of cards. So it could all collapse unless the debt, from the standpoint of the zombie capital issue, it can all collapse unless companies can continue to roll over their debt, right? And roll over their debt by getting access to cheap credit. So if you want to keep playing this game, which it can go on indefinitely, so I don't think it ultimately collapses, but a problem is that you have to keep interest rates really low to keep it going. When interest rates are really low, then people are going to look around for alternate returns, right? If all you can get from buying a treasury bill, the safest asset is like the 0.025%, whatever, then you're going to look out in the global economy to see if you can get a better return somewhere. So another dimension of the story is this leads to massive stampedes into stock markets in other parts of the world, right? Other parts of the, countries that aren't of the imperialist center, if you want to use that vocabulary, right? And because those countries want to attract foreign capital, and so they'll offer higher offerings, or their stocks will look undervalued, and you'll get all this massive money, flowing in there, looking for a higher return because the debt game makes the interest rate so low here. But of course, again, their PE ratio will start to go crazy. And so some investors will start to get scared, or the Fed will try to raise interest rates to make things a little bit more normal. And then there'll be this massive stampede out of those countries back to the US. And of course, this destroys these local economies, right? Or at least puts a lot of pressure on the vulnerable people in these local economies. So that's so again, I think capitalism doesn't just collapse, right? It could keep doing this indefinitely, but the social cost, the human cost, becomes more and more intense over time. So it's part of the story too.
May I put a question? What do you think is the relationship between the Black Lives Matter uprisings and the financial crisis that we've been discussing?
Is that to me?
Well, it's obvious that people of color and women have suffered discrimination for centuries and centuries and centuries, and people have just had it. And they have a sense that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. You do not need a PhD in economics to see this. It's obvious. It's everywhere in front of you. There's building huge skyscrapers going on in cities while slums are crumbling. It's obvious that some people are doing extremely well, but most people are just being crushed.
Yeah. I mean, it just clearly shows, and this came out so well in Betsy's talk. I mean, it just clearly shows that if you think the purpose of the state is to serve the public interest, then you don't understand the capitalist state, right? You can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? And so you actually look at what it does, and it shows what its priorities are, right? Its priorities are to help banks that have gotten into trouble by having a lot of corporate bonds on their books that may not be worth much. And it will do everything it possibly can to solve that problem by buying these bonds and just dumping all this money into the banks just to restore them to safety. And it just gives that the social priority over addressing the racial disparities that have built up in this country over decades, right? I mean, we know all the statistics about average Black wealth, household wealth relative to average white household wealth. And we know that that was caused by, to a tremendous extent, caused by government policies. Government urban renewal policies, government going along with banks redlining instead of regulating the banks to prevent that. And that we're still living out the results of these government policies and relatively recent government policies, like post-World War II government policies. And instead of trying to rectify that problem, which the government itself has caused, it's made saving the banks a higher priority. So I think Black Lives Matter is reflects. I mean, certainly some of the energy of rage and resistance against the status quo comes out of seeing such a clear example of what the government priorities are, of the things that you talked about this afternoon.
And the fact that these demonstrations are worldwide, that across the entire globe, people are demonstrating and with their signs, Black Lives Matter, in London, in Berlin, in Sydney, Australia, all over the world. People everywhere know that after 40 years of neoliberal policies that have been put in place and throughout the globe since 1980, that they're hurting and that governments are not doing anything to help the average person. It's blatant, it's obvious, and people are fed up. And the stakes get greater every year as more and more people fall further behind, fall further into debt, have more and more illness, have more and more bankruptcies. Every year the stakes get higher, the wealthy get wealthier, the poor get poorer, and the police are out there to protect private property and wealth. They're not out there to protect average people. And I just hope that there can be a fundamental shift in government policies before the entire globe degenerates into low intensity conflict around the planet, with the haves fighting against the have-nots and the pitchforks coming out. There has to be a peaceful transition to something else, to some sort of production for need rather than production for profit, because even the big corporations can't make profits anymore. So we need to collectively, in the post-COVID world, we need to make a peaceful transition to production for need rather than production for profit, and to solve the pressing problems that we have. We only have 10 years to solve the climate catastrophe that is coming closer every day. And we need good government.
I want to thank Betsy Bowman, our speaker, and Tony Smith, our commentator. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed today's program, please tune in again next Monday for Jeff Foe's talk on whether the Democrats can stop fascism. Our revenue raising programs at the Center for Global Justice have been canceled due to the coronavirus. So if you can donate to support the Global Justice Report, please do so on our webpage. We're a fresh new voice. We have enormous resources and wonderful speakers and wonderful treasures to come. I want to thank Colette Mora, Liz Mestris, Cliff Duran, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, and I want to especially thank you for tuning in and participating in Global Justice Report. We'll see you next week at Jeff Foe's talk, which will be Monday, July 6th at 11 Pacific time, 1 Central time,
29.
and 2 Eastern time. Excuse me, it will be next Monday, June 29th. Join us through our Global Justice website. Thank you very much for participating.
And thank you, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week.